Welcome back. Tonight we're going somewhere warm and colourful and alive with the sound of a brass section that never quite stops playing. Tonight we're going to the Inkwell Isles, that gorgeous hand-drawn rubber hose world of 1930s cartoon logic and surprisingly dark theology, and we are going to spend a long, slow, comfortable stretch of time learning everything there is to know about it. Not as a story, not as a lore deep dive, though there is plenty of lore woven through what follows. Tonight we are doing something a little different. Tonight we are doing facts, more than 300 of them, moving through every corner of the game, from the development secrets that shaped it to the animation history that inspired it, from the tiny hidden details you might have missed to the design choices that took years to execute, from the characters and their origins to the world they inhabit, and the systems that make it run. This is the kind of video where you do not need to follow a thread. You do not need to remember where you are in the story, or what came before or what is coming next. Each fact stands on its own, complete and self-contained, and you can drift in and out as you need to, catching some and letting others wash past you, letting the whole warm current of them carry you gently down towards sleep. Get comfortable now. Really settle in. Let your pillow find the right angle, and let your blanket settle around you, and let your body understand that nothing is required of it for the rest of this video except to exist, and eventually to sleep. And if this helps you fall asleep tonight, if this is the kind of company that makes the dark hours easier, then like and subscribe tomorrow morning when you wake up. Just a small gesture, and it means a lot to the channel. Alright, let us begin. 300 and more facts about Cuphead, coming to you now, slow and easy, one at a time. Fact 1. Cuphead was developed by Studio MDHR, a studio founded by two brothers, Chad and Jared Moldenhauer. The name MDHR comes from their surname. It is one of the few major video games in history to be developed primarily by a two-person sibling team, a fact that gives the entire project a quality of shared vision and sustained personal investment that is unusual in an industry that typically involves hundreds of people. Fact 2. The idea for Cuphead began in 2010, when Chad and Jared were inspired by the artwork style of 1930s cartoons and wanted to make a game that looked, as faithfully as possible, like a playable version of 1. The initial concept was simple, a run-and-gun game with boss fights, rendered entirely in the hand-drawn style of the era. That simple concept would take approximately 5 years to become a finished product. Fact 3. Development of Cuphead officially began in 2013. By that point, the Moldenhauer brothers had committed fully to the project, with Chad leaving his day job to work on it full-time. Jared joined him not long after. The decision to go all in on a project of this ambition, with no guarantee of success, is one of the defining facts of the game's origin story. Fact 4. The game was first publicly revealed at E3 2014, where its trailer immediately drew enormous attention for its visual style. And the reaction was strong enough that it validated the direction the brothers had chosen and helped secure the Microsoft partnership that would eventually publish the game on Xbox One and PC. Fact 5. Cuphead was originally planned to be a much smaller game. The initial scope was a single island with a handful of boss fights. As development progressed and the tools and techniques became more refined, the ambition expanded significantly, eventually encompassing 3 full islands, a run-and-gun section, a full overworld map, and dozens of distinct boss encounters. Fact 6. Every single frame of Cuphead's animation was drawn by hand on paper. Not digitally, not on tablets, but on actual physical paper with pencil, in the traditional animation workflow of the 1930s. Those drawings were then inked and painted before being scanned into the computer and assembled into the final game. Fact 7. The team behind Cuphead's animation grew over the course of development from just the two brothers to a team of approximately 20 people by the time the game shipped. Each animator was trained in traditional animation techniques specifically for the project, a significant investment in a craft that most modern game studios do not use. Fact 8. The game used real watercolour paper for its backgrounds, the distinctive texture visible in every background in Cuphead, that warm, slightly irregular quality that makes the environments feel like they were painted rather than rendered, comes from actual watercolour paintings that were created by hand and scanned into the game. This technique is one of the major reasons the game looks so different from anything else in its era. Fact 9. Cuphead's development cost approximately $6 million by the time it shipped, a figure that grew significantly from the original budget as the scope of the project expanded. The majority of that cost went into the animation, which is by far the most labour-intensive element of the game's production. Fact 10. The game shipped in September 2017, after several delays from its originally planned 2015 release date. Each delay was the result of scope expansion rather than production problems, as the team kept finding ways to add more to a game that was already pushing the limits of what they could create. Fact 11. Within 2 weeks of release, Cuphead had sold over 1 million copies. Within a year, it had sold over 3 million. These numbers established it as one of the most commercially successful indie games of its era, and validated the enormous investment of time and money that the Moldenhauer brothers had made. Fact 12. Cuphead won Best Art Direction at the Game Awards in 2017, an award that surprised almost no one who had seen the game. It also won Best Independent Game. These were among the most unanimously agreed upon wins in the ceremony's history, reflecting the unusual consensus that had formed around the game's visual achievement. Fact 13. The game was developed primarily in Unity, a game engine more commonly associated with mobile games and indie projects than with the kind of technically sophisticated 2D rendering that Cuphead required. Significant custom work was done to make Unity capable of displaying the animation at the quality level the team required. Fact 14. Cuphead's music was composed by Christopher Madigan, a jazz musician and composer who wrote and arranged all of the game's original score. The score consists of over 70 original tracks, all recorded with live musicians, a decision that was absolutely essential to the game's authentic 1930s feel. Fact 15. The recording sessions for the Cuphead soundtrack used orchestras and jazz bands that recorded live in a studio, in the same way that music was recorded for actual 1930s cartoons. The total amount of original music in the game is substantial enough that the soundtrack was released as a standalone product and has been streamed hundreds of millions of times. Fact 16. Composer Christopher Madigan has described the process of writing for the game as one of the most intensive of his career, requiring him to produce authentic-sounding music in the style of a period that he had to extensively research before he could properly inhabit it. He listened to hundreds of hours of period recordings before writing a single note for the game. Fact 17. The sound effects in Cuphead were created to match the era as closely as possible. Many of the game's sound effects were inspired by the Foley work in actual 1930s cartoons, where ordinary objects were used in creative ways to produce the rubbery, exaggerated sounds that characterise the era. Fact 18. Cuphead does not have spoken dialogue. Every character communicates through text in keeping with the aesthetic of early sound film and animation, where dialogue cards and title cards were still a significant part of the visual language. This choice was deliberate and contributes significantly to the sense that the game exists in a genuine historical period rather than simply referencing one. Fact 19. The game's difficulty was a significant topic of discussion upon release. Cuphead is genuinely, intentionally hard in the tradition of the run-and-gun games that inspired it. The Moldenhauer brothers have stated that the difficulty is not a design flaw but a feature, that the game is designed to require mastery and that the feeling of finally overcoming a boss that has defeated you many times is core to the intended experience. Fact 20. A simple mode was added to the game in a later update, allowing players to reduce the health of bosses and the complexity of their attack patterns. This was a controversial decision in some corners of the gaming community, where debates about accessibility and difficulty in games had been running for years. The developers framed it as an expansion of who could enjoy the game rather than a compromise of its design. Fact 21. The Delicious Last Course, the major DLC expansion for Cuphead, was released in June 2022, nearly 5 years after the base game. This gap between original release and expansion was largely the result of the same production realities that delayed the original game, namely the sheer labour intensity of hand-drawing every frame of animation at the quality level the team insisted upon. Fact 22. The Delicious Last Course introduced a new playable character, Ms. Chalice, who had appeared in the base game as a spirit trapped in a cup who could temporarily inhabit the player's body. In the DLC, she becomes a full playable character with her own unique moveset, including a double jump, a parry dash, and a ground slam. Fact 23. The DLC added a fourth island to the game, accessible via a boat from the Isle 1 docks. This island has its own overworld map, its own aesthetic, its own set of boss encounters, and a narrative through line involving a legendary recipe and the chef who is obsessed with completing it. Fact 24. Chad Moldenhauer has described the development of the delicious last course as in many ways harder than the original game, because the team now had a very high standard set by the original that they felt compelled to meet or exceed in every element. The pressure of that self-imposed standard made the development process intense, even by the standards of the original. Fact 25. The Cuphead show, an animated Netflix series based on the game, premiered in February 2022. The show was produced using hand-drawn animation in the style of the game, maintaining the aesthetic commitment of the original. It ran for 3 seasons before concluding in 2023. Fact 26. The Cuphead show was developed by King Features Syndicate and Dave Wasson, with Chad Moldenhauer serving as an executive producer. The involvement of the original creator in the production helped ensure that the show maintained the visual and tonal qualities of the game rather than simply using the characters in a generic animated format. Fact 27. In a notable piece of casting for the show, as comedian and actor Wayne Brady voiced King Dice, the Devil's right-hand man. Brady's vocal performance captured both the showmanship and the menace of the character in a way that the game's text-only presentation could only imply. Fact 28. The voice of the devil in the Cuphead show was provided by Luke Millington Drake, a British actor whose smooth, warm, slightly theatrical delivery matched the character's combination of charm and menace. The show's devil is slightly more comedically inclined than the game's version, reflecting the more light-hearted tone of the animated series. Fact 29. Studio MDHR is a fully independent studio with no external investors. The Moldenhauer brothers funded the original development themselves, including by selling personal possessions during the most financially strained period of the game's creation. This independence has allowed them to maintain complete creative control over the game and its adaptations. Fact 30. The original Cuphead trailer at E3 2014 showed gameplay footage that was substantially different from the finished game. Several boss encounters visible in that trailer were redesigned or replaced entirely before the game shipped. The trailer's primary purpose was to demonstrate the visual style rather than the final game design. Fact 31. Cuphead was a launch title for the Xbox One X when that console released in November 2017, just 2 months after the game's original release. The higher resolution version of the game took advantage of the console's capabilities to display the hand-drawn artwork at even higher fidelity than the original release. Fact 32. The game came to Nintendo Switch in April 2019, a release that significantly expanded its audience by making it portable for the first time. The Switch version was developed with the full involvement of Studio MDHR, rather than being outsourced to an external porting team. Fact 33. A physical edition of Cuphead was eventually released after years of the game being available only digitally. The physical release included the base game and the delicious last course, and came in special packaging themed to the game's aesthetic, becoming a collector's item for fans. Fact 34. The game was submitted to the Guinness World Records for its animation technique. While the specific record category it was submitted under has varied in reporting, it represents an acknowledgement that what Studio MDHR accomplished in terms of traditional animation in a modern video game is genuinely unusual and historically significant. Fact 35. The Cuphead soundtrack has been performed live at several video game music concerts, including performances at MagFest and other gaming events. The live performance of big band jazz from a video game in concert settings is a notable example of game music achieving the kind of cultural status that had previously been associated mainly with orchestral game scores. Fact 36. Chad Moldenhauer was the primary art director and visual designer of the game, while Jared Moldenhauer handled much of the game design and production coordination. However, the division of labour between the two brothers was fluid in practice, with both involved in most aspects of the game's creation. Fact 37. The game's title font and all of its text design were created to match the period aesthetic as closely as possible. The specific letter forms used in Cuphead titles and cards are drawn from actual 1930s typography giving even the text of the game a visual authenticity that contributes to the overall sense of historical immersion. Fact 38. Several of the game's boss designs went through extensive revision before arriving at their final forms. The Moldenhauer brothers have shared concept art in interviews and retrospectives that shows how different some bosses looked in early development, with some characters going through half a dozen or more complete redesigns before settling into the versions that appear in the finished game. Fact 39. The game's parry mechanic, which requires the player to jump into pink objects to gain super meter, is one of the more unusual design choices in the game, and one that took significant iteration to feel right. Early versions of the parry system worked differently, and the team spent considerable time finding the version that felt both challenging and satisfying. Fact 40. Cuphead's camera system was designed to always keep the action visible, while maintaining the feel of watching an animated short film. The camera in most of the boss fights moves in ways that feel choreographed rather than reactive, panning and zooming in ways that feel like directorial choices rather than mechanical tracking. Fact 41. The game's health system, which represents health as cards rather than a traditional health bar, is one of dozens of ways in which the interface elements of the game were designed to feel native to the 1930s aesthetic rather than anachronistic. The card-based health display fits naturally into a world whose most powerful character runs a casino. Fact 42. The coins scattered throughout the run-and-gun levels and the overworld can be spent at Porkrind's shop to purchase new weapons and charms. The shopkeeper, Porkrind, is a pig, continuing the game's tradition of characters who are anthropomorphized food or kitchenware existing alongside beings who are anthropomorphized animals in a world where these categories do not seem to cause confusion. Fact 43. The weapons available in Porkrind's shop are all named and designed to fit the aesthetic of the world, from the spread, a shotgun-like scattershot, to the lobber, a projectile that bounces along the ground, to the charge, a powerful chargeable shot that references the classic mechanics of many 1930s arcade games. None of them look like anything that belongs to a conventional weaponry system, which is exactly right. Fact 44. The Charms system, which allows players to equip passive bonuses, was designed to give players meaningful choices about how they approach the game, without making any single option feel mandatory. Several charms are genuinely transformative of the play experience, including the Coffee Charm, which starts the player with a full super meter, and the Twin Heart Charm, which adds an extra hit point at the cost of reduced super meter gain. Fact 45. The P-meter, which tracks how many parries a player has performed in a level, feeds into the simple versus regular versus expert grading system that evaluates the player's performance at the end of each encounter. Getting an A+ grade on every level is one of the game's harder optional challenges, requiring mastery of the parry mechanic in addition to simply surviving. Fact 46. The game contains no microtransactions, no loot boxes, no battle pass, and no ongoing monetization of any kind. This was a deliberate choice by the Moldenhauer brothers, who wanted the game to be a complete product that players paid for once and owned outright. In the context of the games industry of 2017, this was a notable decision. Fact 47. The Cuphead development team grew from 2 people to approximately 30 by the end of the DLC's development, including animators, programmers, musicians, and production staff. Despite this growth, the studio has remained independent and privately owned throughout, with no external investment or publisher ownership. Fact 48. The game's loading screens use the image of a film projector running a reel, reinforcing the cinematic framing of the experience. The loading screen is one of dozens of interface elements that were designed to reinforce the sense that you're watching a film rather than playing a game, even in the moments when no gameplay is happening. Fact 49. Cuphead's achievements and trophies were designed with the same care as the rest of the game, with names and descriptions that fit the period aesthetic and often reference specific elements of the game's narrative or visual design. Collecting all of them is a completionist challenge that requires seeing essentially everything the game has to offer. Fact 50. The game's ending, in which Cuphead returns the soul contracts to the devil and then defeats him in combat, was the subject of extensive internal debate during development. Alternative endings were considered, including versions where the outcome was more ambiguous or where the characters suffered greater consequences for their choices. The team ultimately settled on an ending that they felt was tonally appropriate for the world they had built. Fact 51. A second playable character, Mugman, Cuphead's brother, is available for the second player in cooperative play. In single-player mode, Mugman is available as an alternate character choice, with identical abilities to Cuphead, but a different visual design, blue where Cuphead is red, with a straw coming out of his head rather than a handle. Fact 52. The game shipped with 19 boss encounters in the main campaign, plus the King Dice encounter at the end of Isle 3, which is itself a series of smaller encounters, plus the Devil as the final boss. The DLC added 6 additional boss encounters, bringing the total to well over 24 distinct fight encounters, each with multiple phases, making the game's boss content among the most extensive of any game in its genre. Fact 53. The animation style of Cuphead is specifically modelled on the Fleischer Studios era of American animation, which ran roughly from the late 1920s through the early 1940s. Fleischer Studios was responsible for some of the most distinctive and influential animation of the early sound era, including the original Betty Boop cartoons and the early Popeye shorts. Fact 54. Max and Dave Fleischer, the brothers who ran Fleischer Studios, were responsible for several significant technical innovations in animation, including the rotoscope, a device that allowed animators to trace over live-action footage to create more realistic movement. Their work influenced virtually every major animation studio that came after them. Fact 55. The rubbery, elastic quality of characters in Cuphead, the way limbs stretch and compress and bounce in ways that defy physics, is called squash and stretch, one of the 12 fundamental principles of animation, identified by Disney animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston in their 1981 book The Illusion of Life. In the 1930s, this principle was applied with particular exuberance, and Cuphead replicates that exuberance faithfully. Fact 56. The black outlines around every character in Cuphead are thicker than those in most modern animation, another period-accurate choice. 1930s animation used thick, confident outlines that were necessary for the printing and projection technologies of the time. Cuphead replicates this thickness as part of its visual authenticity. Fact 57. Many characters in 1930s cartoons had white gloves for the practical reason that white gloves were easier to see against the dark backgrounds common in early animation. Cuphead includes white-gloved characters as an homage to this tradition, the most prominent being various enemies and background characters whose gloves are both visually correct for the period and quietly amusing as a design choice. Fact 58. The musical notes that float across the screen in some of Cuphead's levels are a direct reference to early synchronized sound cartoons, in which musical notation was sometimes literally animated as part of the visual language of the piece. The first fully synchronized sound cartoon was Steamboat Willie in 1928, and the relationship between animation and music was particularly close in the years that followed. Fact 59. Several of Cuphead's bosses are designed as direct references to specific characters or tropes from 1930s animation. The general type of the rubbery, expressive, slightly unhinged cartoon character who transforms fluidly between states is lifted directly from the visual vocabulary of the era. Fact 60. The film grain effect visible in Cuphead, that slight organic texture that gives the image a sense of having been recorded rather than generated, is a deliberate post-processing effect added to reinforce the sense of watching a projected film. Real 1930s animation had this quality because of the physical properties of celluloid film, and replicating it digitally required careful study of what film grain actually looks like. Fact 61. The aspect ratio used in Cuphead's presentation is a nod to the aspect ratios common in early cinema, which were more square than the widescreen ratios used in modern games and films. The slightly more compact horizontal frame of Cuphead is another detail that contributes to its period authenticity. Fact 62. The colour palette of Cuphead was carefully researched to match the colour reproduction capabilities of Technicolor film processing in the 1930s. The colours in the game are rich and saturated, but have a specific quality, a warmth and slight oversaturation that matches the look of actual Technicolor photography, rather than the cooler, more neutral tones of modern digital colour. Fact 63. The animation in Cuphead runs at a frame rate of 24 frames per second for characters, matching the frame rate of film, while the game itself runs at a higher frame rate. This deliberate mismatch between the animation frame rate and the display frame rate is one of the most technically interesting aspects of the game's production, and achieving it required custom solutions that the team developed specifically for the project. Fact 64. Many of the transformations bosses undergo during their fight phases are animated in a style called metamorphosis animation, a technique common in 1930s cartoons where characters would fluidly transform into other shapes as part of the visual comedy. Watching a boss transform between phases in Cuphead has the same quality as watching one of these metamorphosis sequences in an actual period cartoon. Was Fact 65. The practice of anthropomorphizing everyday objects, giving faces and personalities to items like cups, teapots, vegetables and coins, was common in 1930s animation and is a central element of Cuphead's world. The visual logic that allows a cup to be the hero, and a flower to be a villain and a playing card to be a manager, follows the same rules as actual cartoons of the period. Fact 66. The backgrounds in Cuphead are more detailed and visually complex than those in most actual 1930s cartoons, reflecting the team's desire to create backgrounds that would hold up to the scrutiny of players pausing and zooming in on individual frames. Real 1930s backgrounds were often quite spare, a practical concession to the labour cost of animation. But Cuphead's backgrounds have the density of visual detail that the era aspired to, even if it could not always achieve it. Fact 67. The specific way that characters react to being hit in Cuphead, that brief flash and stagger, is animated with the exaggerated physicality of 1930s slapstick. Getting hit in Cuphead looks like getting hit in a cartoon, which is to say it looks funnier and more theatrical than painful, in keeping with the visual language of a world where physical consequences are temporary and reversible. Fact 68. The overworld map of Cuphead, with its top-down view and small walking character figures, is a reference to the board game adjacent maps used in early animated shorts and films to indicate a character's journey. It has the quality of a children's game board, another connection between the game's visual language and the broader aesthetic territory of the 1930s. Fact 69. The game's title screen, with its film projector and curtain, and the specific typeface of the title card, is designed to look exactly like the opening of an actual 1930s animated short. This framing establishes from the very first moment the game is launched that you're about to watch and participate in something that wants to be understood as a piece of period cinema rather than a conventional video game. Fact 70. The credit sequence of Cuphead is animated in the style of actual 1930s cartoon credits, with the names moving in that particular way that early animation credits moved, rolling up the screen in a typeface that looks hand-drawn even when it is not. This attention to the credits as an aesthetic object rather than just functional information is another example of the team's commitment to the period aesthetic in every element of the production. Fact 71. The Fleischer brothers' most famous original character, Betty Boop, was herself based on a combination of popular culture references of the late 1920s, including jazz singer Helen Kane and the flapper aesthetic of the era. Betty Boop's success demonstrated that animated characters could have genuine cultural resonance beyond their role as entertainment, a lesson that Cuphead and Mugman have themselves demonstrated in the modern era. Fact 72. Popeye the Sailor, who originated as a comic strip character before being adapted into animation by Fleischer Studios, is one of the most visible reference points for the aesthetic of the Cuphead world. The combination of exaggerated physical features, absurdist situations, musical soundtrack, and genuine physical comedy that defines the Popeye cartoons is one of the clearest ancestors of Cuphead's visual and tonal sensibility. Fact 73. The Disney Silly Symphonies series, which ran from 1929 to 1939, is another important reference for Cuphead's aesthetic. The Silly Symphonies were specifically designed to showcase animated movements synchronized to music, and many of them featured the kind of anthropomorphized objects and creatures that populate the Inkwell Isles. Fact 74. Ub-Iwerks, the animator who co-created Mickey Mouse with Walt Disney, was known for his extraordinary drawing speed and his ability to maintain consistent character design across huge volumes of animation. The challenge of maintaining consistent character design across thousands of hand-drawn frames in Cuphead is one that the team's animators understood directly as a professional challenge that connects them to the craftspeople of the 1930s. Fact 75. The specific quality of the inking in Cuphead, the way the lines have slight variations in thickness, and the occasional imperfection that suggests a human hand rather than a mechanical process, was actually something the team had to work to preserve. The natural tendency in production was to clean up and perfect the lines, and the team had to actively resist that tendency to maintain the handmade quality that is essential to the game's look. Fact 76. Several animation historians and scholars have written about Cuphead as a significant document of what 1930s animation actually looked like, arguing that the game preserves and demonstrates techniques and aesthetics that are difficult to describe in academic writing but immediately recognisable to anyone who has seen the game. This position of the game as a kind of living museum of early animation history is one of its more unexpected cultural functions. Fact 77. The specific way that smoke and explosions are animated in Cuphead, that puffy, circular, expanding cloud shape that has become one of the signature visual elements of the game, is derived directly from how actual 1930s animators drew smoke and explosions. The visual vocabulary for depicting these phenomena had not yet standardized in that era, and the Fleischer style of smoke animation is particularly distinctive. Fact 78. The facial expressions of characters in Cuphead, particularly in the boss fights when bosses cycle through different emotional states, are animated with an exaggeration that is characteristic of the era. Real 1930s animation used extreme facial expressions as a primary tool of character communication, partly because the limited frame rates and low resolution of projection made subtle expressions difficult to read. Fact 79. The walk cycles of characters in Cuphead, the way Cuphead himself moves across the overworld or through run and gun sections, were designed to have the same bouncy rhythmic quality as 1930s character locomotion. Getting a walk cycle to feel right is one of the fundamental challenges of character animation, and Cuphead's walk has been specifically praised by animation professionals for its authenticity. Fact 80. The specific shade of red used for Cuphead's body was the subject of extensive development. The team needed a red that read correctly in the game's lighting conditions, that looked right against the warm watercolour backgrounds, that felt authentic to the Technicolor palette of the era, and that was distinctive enough to make the character immediately recognisable at any scale. Finding that precise red took longer than it might seem like it should have. Fact 81. The straw that protrudes from Cuphead's head is both a visual gag and a practical design element. As a visual gag, it plays on the idea that Cuphead is a drinking cup, and drinking straws in this period would have been the striped paper variety that is now associated with retro diners. As a design element, it gives the character a distinctive silhouette that is immediately recognisable even at small sizes. Fact 82. The handle on the side of Cuphead's head, which corresponds to the handle of a teacup, was one of the design elements that went through the most iteration before the team was satisfied with it. Handles can read differently depending on the angle they are viewed from, and the challenge of making the handle look right from all the angles the character is viewed from in the game required careful work. Fact 83. Mugman, Cuphead's brother, has a mug shape rather than a cup shape, a distinction that is subtle but genuine. Mugs tend to be taller and more cylindrical than cups, and this difference is reflected in Mugman's proportions. He's also slightly more elongated than Cuphead, a visual distinction that helps players distinguish between them in cooperative play. Fact 84. The clouds in Cuphead's overworld map have faces, in keeping with the period tradition of animating all natural phenomena as sentient beings. The specific expressions on these cloud faces are not random. They have been designed to have the slightly grumpy, slightly bemused expression that clouds have in a surprising number of actual 1930s cartoons. Fact 85. The Isle 2 overworld has a carnival aesthetic that draws specifically on the visual vocabulary of actual 1930s travelling carnivals and amusement parks. The specific colours, the typography of the signs, the design of the rides and attractions. Not all of these were researched from actual historical photographs of the period to ensure accuracy. Fact 86. Isle 3's moodier, cooler aesthetic, with its grey tones and maritime references, draws on the horror and mystery cartoons of the 1930s, which were a distinct subgenre of animated shorts that used the medium's flexibility for something other than comedy. The Popeye and Betty Boop series both occasionally ventured into this territory, and Isle 3 draws on that tradition. Fact 87. The transformation sequences that many bosses undergo between phases, where they change form dramatically, are animated with particular care and complexity because they represent moments of maximum visual interest. The team spent disproportionate animation time on these transitions, knowing that they would be the moments that players remembered most clearly. Fact 88. The miniature versions of bosses that sometimes appear as sub-elements of a larger fight, small replicas that break off and attack independently, draw on the visual comedy of scale variation that was a staple of 1930s animation. The surprise of a small version of something large appearing and behaving with the same menace as its larger original is a specific kind of cartoon gag with a long history. Fact 89. The vintage newsreel aesthetic that appears in certain transitional sequences in the game draws on the actual newsreel format of the 1930s, when short films of news events were screened before feature films in movie theatres. These newsreels had a specific visual quality, from the slightly overexposed look of early film stock to the stentorian narrator voice, that the game references in its own way. Fact 90. The use of iris shots, where the image closes down to a shrinking circle, a common transitional device in early cinema, appears in Cuphead as one of the ways the game signals the end of an encounter or the transition between areas. This specific visual device connects the game directly to the editing vocabulary of 1930s film. Fact 91. The game's approach to showing damage, where hit characters flash white briefly before returning to their normal appearance, is borrowed from the visual conventions of early animation rather than from conventional video game design. In 1930s cartoons, physical impacts were often shown through a brief flash of white, and Cuphead replicates this rather than using the conventional invincibility flash common to most games of its type. Fact 92. The character of Elder Kettle, Cuphead and Mugman's guardian, is designed to look like a tea kettle of the specific style common in 1930s illustrations and advertisements, with the broad, rounded body and the curved spout that were standard features of the era's kitchen aesthetic. He is, in a sense, the oldest and most traditional piece of kitchen equipment in a household of younger, more dynamic cups. Fact 93. The coins and tokens visible throughout the Inkwell Isles are drawn with the specific heft and gleam of the metal coins common in cartoons of the era, where coins were often used as visual shorthand for wealth and were depicted with an oversaturated gold that real coins do not actually have. This visual convention is preserved faithfully in the game. Fact 94. The specific way that water is animated in Cuphead, when it appears in environments or boss attacks, draws on the stylized waveforms common in 1930s animation, where water was often represented as a series of curves rather than as realistic fluid simulation. This stylization is more visually interesting than realistic water would be, and fits the game's aesthetic vocabulary perfectly. Fact 95. The game's use of fire as both an environmental element and a boss attack element draws on 1930s depictions of fire as a character in its own right, a writhing expressive shape that has agency and movement. Fire in Cuphead does not look like rendered combustion. It looks like animated fire, which is a meaningfully different thing. Fact 96. The visual representation of music as a physical force in several boss encounters, where musical notes or sound waves become literal projectiles or obstacles, is a reference to the close relationship between animation and music in the 1930s, when the two were so tightly integrated that making the music visible in the animation felt natural rather than strange. Fact 97. The backgrounds of the run and gun levels in Cuphead are among the most detailed and visually rich in the game, designed to reward players who take the time to look at them carefully. Each background contains references, gags, and details that add to the world building of the Inkwell Isles without being essential to playing the level. Fact 98. The visual design of the health, currency, and status indicators in the game was treated with the same seriousness as the character design, resulting in interface elements that feel native to the world rather than overlaid on it. The card-based health display, the coin counter, the super meter, all of these look like they belong in a 1930s cartoon. Fact 99. The game includes several visual references to specific famous cartoons from the era. Fans with knowledge of 1930s animation history have catalogued many of these, ranging from direct visual quotes to more oblique references to specific character designs or animation techniques. The game rewards this kind of deep knowledge without requiring it. Fact 100. The animation of Cuphead's death sequence, in which the character wilts and a small ghost version of him floats upward, is drawn directly from the visual vocabulary of cartoon death in the 1930s, where characters who were eliminated from a scene would sometimes leave a small spectral version of themselves behind. It is simultaneously a visual gag, a period reference, and a functionally clear communication of the game state. Fact 101. The team at Studio MDHR studied hours of actual 1930s animation before beginning production, not just watching it, but analysing it frame by frame to understand the specific choices that animators of the era made and why. This analytical relationship to the source material is visible in the accuracy of the result. Fact 102. The specific texture of the paper on which Cuphead's characters are drawn is visible in the final game as a very slight grain in the character artwork, really different from the film grain applied as a post-processing effect. This layering of textures, paper grain in the characters, watercolour texture in the backgrounds, and film grain on the whole image gives the game a physical quality that is difficult to articulate but immediately perceptible. Fact 103. The way characters in Cuphead cycle through idle animations when not in motion, small fidgets and gestures and moments of self-expression that happen when the character is standing still, was carefully designed to feel spontaneous and alive rather than mechanical. Idle animations are one of the primary ways in which animated characters express personality, and the team invested significantly in making Cuphead's idle animations feel genuine. Fact 104. The animation team's work on Cuphead has been widely cited in animation circles as a significant revival of interest in traditional hand-drawn techniques among a generation of animators who had trained primarily in digital methods. The success of the game demonstrated that there was genuine enthusiasm for traditional animation quality, and it inspired several other projects to pursue similar approaches. Fact 105. Cuphead was designed to be visually simple enough to be drawn quickly and consistently across thousands of frames of animation, while also being expressive enough to carry the emotional weight of a protagonist. This balance between simplicity and expressiveness is one of the central challenges of character design for animation, and Cuphead resolves it elegantly. Fact 106. The name Cuphead is a compound of the character's physical form and the common practice in 1930s animation of naming characters after their most visually distinctive feature. Characters in that era were often named in ways that announced their appearance directly, from Popeye's defining physical characteristic to the Inkwell Isle's own tradition of characters named after what they are. Fact 107. Mugman is canonically younger than Cuphead, though the age gap is never specified. Their relationship is one of genuine affection and loyalty, with Mugman often serving as the more cautious and sensible of the two, providing a counterweight to Cuphead's impulsivity. In the animated show, this dynamic is developed at length. Fact 108. Elder Kettle is the character who sends Cuphead and Mugman on their adventure, giving them the tools they need and providing context for what they are facing. He represents the mentor archetype that appears in many adventure stories, the wise elder whose guidance sets the hero on their path. In the visual language of the game, he also represents an older generation of kitchen equipment, the stately tea kettle to the younger, more dynamic cups. Fact 109. The Devil's design draws on a long tradition of cartoon devil characters in American popular culture, including several from the 1930s era that directly inspired the game. The specific combination of red skin, pointed horns, and a sophisticated personal presentation has a history in animation and advertising that predates the game by several decades. Fact 110. King Dice is one of the most visually striking characters in the game, a playing card made flesh. Or rather a character whose head is a playing card while the rest of him is a dapper humanoid figure. The design plays on the relationship between card games and chance, and the specific aesthetics of casino culture in a way that feels organic to the world of the Inkwell Isles. Fact 111. The specific card suit that King Dice's face displays has been a point of discussion among fans, who have noted that the face card design visible on his head corresponds to a specific card in a standard deck. This level of visual specificity, in what could have been a generic playing card face, is characteristic of the team's attention to detail. Fact 112. Hildeberg, the Zeppelin blimp boss of Isle 1, transforms during her fight into zodiac constellations, cycling through several astrological forms before her final phase. This use of astrology as a visual and mechanical element references the widespread popular interest in astrology in the 1930s, when astrological imagery appeared regularly in advertising, cartoons, and popular culture. Fact 113. Cagney Carnation, the flower boss, has a design that plays on the dual nature of flowers as both beautiful and, in the case of carnivorous plants, predatory. His face cycles between a cheerful expression and a monstrous one, visually representing the same duality that makes the Inkwell Isles itself interesting, the beautiful surface and the dangerous reality beneath. Fact 114. The Baroness von Bon Bon, a candy-themed boss on Isle 2, is notable for her candy castle, which serves as the boss arena and provides a sequence of mini-bosses made of various sweets before the main encounter. The concept of a candy kingdom with a powerful ruler draws on fairy tale traditions that were themselves common reference points for 1930s animation. Fact 115. Wally Warbles, the bird boss on Isle 2, fights from inside a birdcage, which simultaneously serves as a protective barrier for the boss and a visual metaphor for captivity. The specific image of a caged bird has rich resonance in literature and culture, and the game uses it with straightforward visual effectiveness. Fact 116. Grim Matchstick, the dragon boss, is one of the game's most sympathetic characters, at least in terms of design. His expression throughout the fight is not menacing but frightened, which is because the lore of the fight establishes that he is afraid of his own fire. A dragon who is terrified of the fire he breathes is a genuinely sad concept dressed in spectacular visual form. Fact 117. Dr. Karl's robot, the mechanical giant on Isle 3, is one of the most technically complex bosses in the game in terms of the number of simultaneous moving parts. The design is a deliberate tribute to the giant robot and mechanical monster designs, common in science fiction imagery of the 1930s, which imagined future technology as enormous, riveted, steam-powered machines. Fact 118. Sally Stage Play, the theatre-themed boss on Isle 3, fights against a backdrop of a stage performance that proceeds regardless of the fight happening in the foreground. Audience members in the background react to the performance, stagehands move scenery, and the theatrical illusion is maintained even as a combat encounter plays out in front of it. This layering of theatrical space and combat space is one of the game's most sophisticated environmental designs. Fact 119. Werner Wehrmann, the rat boss who lives in a tin can in the mausoleum area, is notable for the pathos of his situation. He is a rat who has made his home inside a discarded tin can, surrounding himself with the detritus of a larger world that does not particularly notice him. The detail of his domestic situation, with furniture and objects scaled to his small size, gives him a kind of poignant specificity. Fact 120. Captain Breenybeard, the pirate ship boss, is notable for being a boss who is himself part of a larger entity. His ship is alive and participates in the fight as an extension of the captain himself, each is with the two functioning as a single entity across multiple fight phases. The relationship between a sea captain and his ship, elevated from metaphor to literal truth, is one of the game's more imaginative boss concepts. Fact 121. The Root Pack, consisting of Motato, Weepy the Carrot, and Psyche P, are collectively one boss encounter, despite being three distinct characters. Their fight involves each of them attacking in turn before a final combined phase. The idea of a vegetable garden as a collective entity, its various inhabitants cooperating against a common threat, is a concept with a lot of cartoon history behind it. Fact 122. Ribby and Croaks, the Frog Brothers, are designed to evoke both the specific aesthetic of cartoon frogs in the 1930s and the more specific cultural context of roadhouses and dance halls in that era. Their combined attack patterns, where they fight both separately and in coordination, reflects their nature as a team, a musical and athletic double act. Fact 123. Jimmy the Great, the genie boss, is one of the most visually complex bosses in the game in terms of the variety of forms he takes during the fight. He cycles through a series of transformed states that reference both the specific mythology of genies and the broader tradition of shape-shifting characters in 1930s animation. Fact 124. Beppy the Clown, the carnival boss on Isle 2, has a design that plays on the specific terror of clowns that has developed as a cultural phenomenon over the decades since the 1930s, when clowns were primarily associated with benign comedy. The game uses Beppy's cheerful visual design against a backdrop of genuine combat menace, creating a character who is funny and threatening simultaneously. Fact 125. Phantom Express, the ghost train boss on Isle 3, is one of the most atmospheric boss encounters in the game, taking place on a train moving through a nocturnal sky. The specific concept of a ghost train has roots in 1930s carnival culture, where ghost train rides were a popular attraction, and the game draws on both the carnival version and the more ghostly, supernatural version. Fact 126. Grim Matchstick's attack, where he creates a line of fire along the bottom of the screen that players must navigate by carefully judging the gaps, is considered one of the more frustrating attack patterns in the game. Its difficulty comes not from its speed, but from its precision requirements, which rewards patient play rather than fast reflexes. Fact 127. The Howling Aces, the plane-themed bosses at the end of the aerial run and gun section, are notable for being one of the few boss encounters in the game that takes place primarily in the air. The aerial combat aesthetic draws on the dogfighting imagery, common in adventure cartoons and serial films of the 1930s. Fact 128. Miss Chalice, the character introduced in The Delicious Last Course, is a princess whose soul has been trapped in a cup by a curse. She appears in the base game as the legendary chalice that can temporarily grant extra abilities to the player, and her backstory, revealed in the DLC, gives her a history that ties into the broader narrative of the Inkwell Isles. Fact 129. Chef Saltbaker, the final boss of The Delicious Last Course, has one of the more complex narrative backstories of any character in the game. His motivation is not simple villainy, but the extreme expression of a desire to complete something he began for reasons that were, at their origin, genuinely caring. The twist in his story represents the DLC's darkest moment. Fact 130. The sub-bosses that appear in the King Dice Gauntlet at the end of Isle 3 are each associated with a different casino or card game concept, from dice to roulette to checkers to playing cards. Their individual designs are compressed versions of full boss encounters, simpler than the main island bosses but still distinct and expressive. Fact 131. Tipsy Troop, one of King Dice's sub-bosses, consists of a trio of interlocked dice that attack by rolling. The visual humour of animate dice trying to harm you by doing the thing that dice are supposed to do anyway is typical of the game's approach to finding comedy in the literal animation of objects that would normally be inanimate. Fact 132. Mangosteen, another King Dice sub-boss, is a piece of fruit that fights in the style of a boxer, drawing on the boxing fruit imagery common in cartoon advertising and illustration of the 1930s, when anthropomorphized fruit was frequently used in food advertising and food-themed entertainment. Fact 133. Mr. Wheezy, a cigar that attacks by smoking, is one of the more absurdist sub-boss concepts in the game. The idea of a cigar as an antagonist draws on the specific cultural position of cigars in 1930s popular culture, where they were associated with wealth, power, fee, and a certain kind of theatrical self-presentation. Fact 134. Piruletta, a roulette wheel who balances and attacks while spinning, is designed to be visually dizzying in a way that reflects her nature. Watching her spin is slightly disorienting, an effect that is entirely intentional and that makes her one of the more unusual visual experiences in the game. Fact 135. The Kingpin, one of the later King Dice sub-bosses, is literally a bowling pin wearing a crown, a visual pun that combines the bowling term for the lead pin with the organised crime term for a powerful criminal leader. This kind of layered visual pun is characteristic of the game's comedic approach. Fact 136. Chips Bettigan, a poker chip, and Fear Lap, a ghostly racehorse, are among the more obscure King Dice sub-bosses, reflecting the wide variety of gambling-related imagery the designers drew from in populating the casino section. The specificity of their designs, each fully realised as a character despite appearing for only a brief encounter, is a mark of the team's commitment to completeness. Fact 137. The Devil's Own boss fight has multiple phases that reveal different aspects of his power and nature. In each phase, his visual design changes to reflect an escalating level of threat, culminating in forms that are far removed from his composed, suited presentation in the opening cutscene. The distance between the polished devil of the intro and the monstrous devil of the final phase is itself a narrative statement about what lies beneath the charm. Fact 138. Cuphead's parry ability, the jump that allows him to slap pink objects to gain super meter, was originally designed as a purely defensive maneuver, but evolved into a central offensive and strategic tool. as the team discovered how much depth it added to the combat. Many of the game's most elegant skill expressions involve chaining parries across multiple encounters. Fact 139. The specific shade of pink used for parryable objects in the game was chosen for maximum visibility against the range of backgrounds and colour palettes the game uses. It is a pink bright enough to read clearly in almost every context, while still fitting within the game's overall colour palette. Fact 140. The game's grading system, which evaluates player performance after each encounter and assigns letter grades from C to S, was designed to encourage players to engage more deeply with the game's mechanics, rather than simply surviving encounters. The requirements for the highest grades push players toward mastery of the parry system and the more difficult weapon options. Fact 141. The Cuphead amiibo, released by Nintendo for the Switch version of the game, is one of the more unusual amiibo ever produced, representing an indie game character, rather than a Nintendo first-party character. The production of an amiibo for Cuphead reflects the degree to which the character had achieved mainstream recognition by the time the Switch release happened. Fact 142. The character design of Cuphead himself has been noted by several critics and designers as one of the most successful examples of a video game character being designed for animation rather than for conventional game character design. Characters designed for animation prioritize silhouette, expressiveness, and consistency across varied movements, and Cuphead satisfies all of these criteria. Fact 143. King Dice's showmanship and theatrical presentation were designed to make him feel like a performer as much as a villain, someone who takes genuine pleasure in the spectacle of what he does, rather than simply being an obstacle. This quality makes him one of the more charismatic antagonists in the game, someone you might almost enjoy being defeated by. Fact 144. The Phantom Express boss fight takes place over a course that scrolls automatically, meaning that players cannot control their horizontal position as freely as in other fights. This creates a specific kind of tension where both the boss and the environment are actively working against the player simultaneously. Fact 145. Grim Matchstick's fear of fire is communicated entirely through his expressions during the fight, without any dialogue or text explanation. The fact that a dragon is terrified of his own fire powers is legible purely from how he looks when he uses them, which is a testament to the quality of the animation. Fact 146. Werner Wehrmann's Tin Can home is one of the most detailed and specific environments in the game, packed with miniature furniture, small objects, and domestic details that tell a story about the character purely through the environment. A close look at the background of his fight reveals considerable care about who this small rat is and how he lives. Fact 147. The Inkwell Isle 1 lighthouse, visible in the background of some areas, is a piece of environmental world building that recurs across different parts of the island, establishing a sense of geographical coherence. Background elements that recur across different areas are one of the ways the game makes the Inkwell Isles feel like a real place rather than a series of disconnected levels. Fact 148. The design of the soul contracts, the physical documents that Cuphead collects from each boss, varies in its visual details from contract to contract. Each contract reflects something about the boss who held it, a visual specificity that rewards close attention but does not require it for the game to be understood. Fact 149. Porkrin the shopkeeper is designed to look like the kind of slightly threatening vendor character common in adventure games of the era that Cuphead draws from tonally, if not visually. His gruff presentation contrasts with the whimsy of most of the game's characters, giving him a memorable distinctiveness. Fact 150. The game includes several non-combat characters encountered on the overworld maps, providing colour and information but not posing a threat. These characters represent the civilian population of the Inkwell Isles, the ordinary inhabitants of a world that is otherwise primarily populated by boss encounters and combat situations. Fact 151. Ms. Chalice's double jump ability, key available when playing as her in the DLC, fundamentally changes the movement vocabulary available to the player. For players accustomed to Cuphead and Mugman's single jump, the addition of a second aerial jump opens up navigation and combat options that the base game does not permit. Fact 152. Chef Saltbaker's Arena, which takes place inside a kitchen bowl, uses the circular nature of the arena to create attack patterns that require the player to navigate the curved surface in ways that differ from the flat plane movement common to most of the game's encounters. This geometric novelty makes him feel fresh even after the player has mastered the movement systems of the rest of the game. Fact 153. The DLC includes a mausoleum section similar to the base games, where players must protect a chalice from attacking ghosts using the parry mechanic. These mausoleum sections are among the most mechanically pure challenges in the game, isolating the parry system and requiring mastery of it in focused, demanding conditions. Fact 154. The graveyard aesthetic of certain areas in Isle 3 draws on the Halloween and Gothic horror imagery common in 1930s cartoons, which frequently visited supernatural settings as a source of both comedy and mild fright. The game's treatment of death-adjacent imagery is characteristically light, maintaining the tonal register of the era it references. Fact 155. The animated expressions of Cuphead himself during the fight sequences, the grimaces and determined looks and moments of apparent surprise, as were animated to enhance the feeling that the player is emotionally connected to the character's experience. Small expressive animations during gameplay, as opposed to cutscenes, are a subtle but effective form of character building. Fact 156. The game's final cutscene, in which the devil is defeated and the soul contracts are returned to the contract holders, is animated with particular care, representing the narrative payoff of the entire game. The visual design of this resolution reflects the tonal register of the game, not triumphant in a bombastic way, but quietly satisfying. Fact 157. Cuphead and Mugman are never explicitly aged in any official material, but their visual design and behaviour are consistently those of children, or at least of youthful beings who have not yet developed the caution that comes with experience. This youth is central to why their story works. They are the kind of characters who make reckless choices and somehow survive them. Fact 158. The specific posture of the devil in his introductory scene, the casual lean against the table, the easy possession of the space he occupies, communicates more about his character in a single image than several paragraphs of description could. The ability of character design and pose to do this kind of immediate characterization work is a craft that the team executes with consistent skill throughout the game. Fact 159. The character of King Dice is notable for being one of the few characters in the game who interacts with the player directly in the narrative, addressing them through intermediary mechanics. His role as the gatekeeper between the player and the devil gives him a structural position that reinforces his narrative role as the devil's representative and enforcer. Fact 160. The relationship between Cuphead and Mugman is handled in the game primarily through their parallel existence as playable characters rather than through explicit narrative. They are always together, always functioning as a unit, and the game's structure reflects this by making their story inseparable from each other's, even when only one of them is being played. Fact 161. The ghost version of Cuphead that floats upward when he dies appears to express a different emotion each time, ranging from resignation to mild annoyance. This variation in the death animation is a small but charming detail that rewards players who see it enough times to notice the differences. Fact 162. The cup and mug designs of the two main characters were not the first character concepts the team considered. Early development included other character concepts before the kitchen vessel idea was settled on. The cup and mug ultimately won out because they provided a visual pun, the drinking vessel, as the vessel for the soul that tied elegantly into the game's narrative themes. Fact 163. The name Inkwell Isles refers to an inkwell, the container of ink used for writing and drawing, connecting the game's physical world to its medium of creation. The world of the game is made of ink, literally and figuratively. The isles are drawings, and their name acknowledges this. Fact 164. The three main islands of the Inkwell Isles each have a distinct visual identity that reflects a different aspect of 1930s animation and popular culture. Isle 1 is pastoral and sunlit, Isle 2 is carnival and festive, Isle 3 is darker and more atmospheric. The progression from light to dark mirrors the escalating difficulty and narrative weight of the game. Fact 165. Inkwell. Hell, the fourth location, is the only area of the game that is entirely underground. Its warm red and orange colour palette contrasts deliberately with the cooler tones of the surface world. creating an immediate visual sense of having descended somewhere fundamentally different. Fact 166. The overworld maps of each isle are designed to give a sense of the geography of the island, with paths between locations that imply the existence of the areas between them even when those areas cannot be visited. The visual logic of the overworld maps contributes to the sense that the Inkwell Isles are a real place with a coherent geography. Fact 167. The run and gun levels, which are spread across the 3 isles, represent a different play mode from the boss fights and serve as both a change of pace and a source of coins for Porkrin's shop. They are also some of the most densely detailed environments in the game, with backgrounds full of information about the world. Fact 168. The mausoleum levels, where players must protect a chalice from incoming ghosts, are purely parry-based challenges. They do not involve shooting, do not require dodging in the conventional sense, and test a single skill in focused conditions. Their existence as a distinct category of challenge represents the game's understanding that variety in gameplay modes enhances the overall experience. Fact 169. The Isle 1 lighthouse appears in both the overworld map and in the background of certain levels, establishing it as a fixed geographical reference point. Lighthouses in 1930s visual culture were strongly associated with navigation, isolation, and the sea, and its presence on Isle 1 contributes to the island's coastal character. Fact 170. The carnival setting of Isle 2 includes a roller coaster that can be seen in the background of several levels. This roller coaster serves as environmental world building, suggesting that the carnival extends beyond the areas the player visits directly. Fact 171. Isle 3's graveyard, visible in several areas of the island, is one of the darker visual elements of the game, and one of the clearest signals that Isle 3 occupies a different tonal register from the earlier islands. Graveyards in 1930s cartoons were standard settings for supernatural and comedic horror, and the game uses the visual vocabulary of the era to establish atmosphere. Fact 172. The sea visible around the edges of the Inkwell Isles is drawn with the stylized waveforms characteristic of 1930s animation, where water was represented through curves and shapes, rather than realistic fluid dynamics. The sea in the Inkwell Isles looks like an illustration of water rather than water itself. Fact 173. The paths on the overworld maps that connect locations are dotted rather than solid lines, in keeping with the board game aesthetic of the overworld. Dotted lines indicating movement or direction are a visual convention with a long history in both game design and map making, and their use here connects the game to both traditions. Fact 174. The coins visible in the run and gun levels, which represent the currency used at Porkrin's shop, are depicted with the exaggerated golden gleam of cartoon coins rather than the flat representation of real metal. Cartoon coins always look more gold, more round, and more definitively coin-shaped than real coins, and Cuphead's coins follow this tradition. Fact 175. The weapons and charms available in Porkrin's shop are not available from the beginning of the game. Players must earn coins in run and gun levels before they can purchase them, thus creating a natural progression system that rewards thorough engagement with all the game's content rather than allowing players to proceed directly to the boss fights. Fact 176. The secret rooms hidden within the run and gun levels, which contain hidden coins and sometimes reference specific elements of the game's lore or visual history, reward players who explore carefully rather than simply completing objectives. These secrets are consistent with the tradition of hidden content in run and gun games dating back to the genre's origins. Fact 177. The visual design of Inkwell Hell's casino is based on research into actual casino design of the 1930s, when casinos had a specific aesthetic involving red and black colour schemes, elaborate light fixtures, and a mixture of elegance and excess. The game's version of a 1930s casino feels authentic because it was designed from authentic sources. Fact 178. The playing card imagery throughout Inkwell Hell, from King Dice's head to the card suit-themed fighters, among the King Dice sub-bosses, draws on the deep association between card games and gambling that makes playing cards a natural visual language for a casino setting. Fact 179. The slot machine imagery in Inkwell Hell, which appears in the background and in certain gameplay elements, references the history of slot machines as casino fixtures. The first mechanical slot machines were introduced in the 1890s, and by the 1930s they were a fixture of gambling establishments. Their presence in Inkwell Hell is historically accurate and visually appropriate. Fact 180. The dice in the King Dice sub-boss sequence are depicted with the specific red and white dots of standard Western dice, a visual choice that is both accurate and immediately readable to any player familiar with conventional dice. The specificity of this detail is characteristic of the game's commitment to visual accuracy and its references. Fact 181. The Mausoleum on Isle 3, where players complete the parry-only challenge levels, has a visual design that draws on specific traditions of ornate Victorian and early 20th century tomb architecture. The carved stone, the columns, and the general atmosphere of elaborate commemoration are all visually accurate to the kind of mausoleum that was common in the era the game references. Fact 182. The circus imagery on Isle 2, including the big top tent visible in the background of certain areas and the rides and attractions visible throughout the island, draws on the specific visual vocabulary of travelling circuses in the 1930s, when circuses were a major form of entertainment and had a well-established set of visual conventions. Fact 183. The cotton candy and popcorn and other carnival food imagery throughout Isle 2's levels and backgrounds are drawn with the exaggerated colours and forms that made food illustration in the 1930s so visually distinctive. The specific colours of pink cotton candy and yellow popcorn are brighter and more saturated in the game than they would be in real life. Fact 184. The stars and planets visible in the backgrounds of certain levels, particularly the higher altitude sections of Isle 1, thus are drawn in the stylised way that early animation represented the cosmos, as simple shapes against a dark background rather than as scientifically accurate renderings of astronomical objects. Fact 185. The lightning that appears in certain Isle 3 backgrounds is drawn as a jagged white line rather than as a realistic branching electrical discharge, in keeping with the cartoon visual vocabulary for lightning that was established in early animation, and has persisted as a visual convention even as realistic lightning effects became technically possible. Fact 186. The fog and mist effects visible in certain Isle 3 areas give the island a gothic atmosphere that distinguishes it from the clearer, brighter environments of the earlier islands. The specific visual quality of cartoon fog, rendered as overlapping curved shapes rather than as a particle simulation, is another period-accurate detail. Fact 187. The cannons visible in the background of certain levels are drawn with the rounded, slightly toy-like quality of cartoon cannons rather than the angular, utilitarian form of real military cannons. Cartoon cannons have their own visual tradition that has been refined over decades of animation, and the game draws on this tradition naturally. Fact 188. The boats and ships visible in the Isle 3 coastal areas are drawn in the specific style of 1930s cartoon ships, with exaggerated curves and a visual solidity that makes them look like toys rather than like real vessels. The stylization of nautical imagery in early animation has its own distinctive history. Fact 189. The cemetery fence visible in the Isle 3 graveyard area is drawn with the elaborate ironwork typical of Victorian cemetery design, a reference to an earlier period that was itself historical within the 1930s. The visual layers of historical reference in the game reward knowledge of design history. Fact 190. The Isle 2 roller coaster visible in the background has a wooden structure rather than the metal structure common in modern roller coasters, reflecting the fact that wooden roller coasters were the standard in the 1930s era the game references. This architectural accuracy is another small detail that contributes to the game's overall historical coherence. Fact 191. The signage visible in the Inkwell Isle's backgrounds uses typography from the 1930s, with letterforms and layouts that are historically accurate to the era's graphic design conventions. Signs in the game look like signs from actual photographs of the period, another layer of research visible in the finished product. Fact 192. The specific way the overworld map loads, with the character walking between locations on the dotted path, was designed to feel like watching a film reel advancing between frames, a small but satisfying animation that reinforces the cinematic framing of the experience. Fact 193. The shop interface in Porkerin's store uses visual design elements that evoke the general stores and apothecary shops common in rural areas of the 1930s United States, with jars and bottles on shelves and a counter serving as the point of transaction. The specific aesthetic of small-town commerce in that era is captured in the shop's design. Fact 194. The visual representation of the supermeter, which fills as players parry and deal damage and can be expended for powerful attacks, uses imagery that fits naturally into the visual language of the game rather than the conventional health and meter displays of other games. The way the meter fills and depletes feels organic to the world, rather than like an imported game interface element. Fact 195. The death animation of bosses, where they are revealed to have been holding the soul contract somewhere on their person or immediately produce it upon defeat, is both a narrative convenience and a visual payoff. The moment of contract delivery is always animated with particular expressiveness, giving each defeat a sense of completion, yet a fact 196. The musical stings that play at the start of each boss fight, the brief moment of musical introduction before the main battle theme begins, were composed to reflect something about the specific character of each boss. A player who listens closely can hear elements of the boss's personality in their musical introduction. Fact 197. The weather effects visible in certain areas of the overworld, including clouds and sun and atmospheric variation, were included to make the overworld feel alive rather than static. A world where the weather changes is a world that feels inhabited, and the small variations in the overworld atmosphere contribute to this sense. Fact 198. The ambient sounds audible in the overworld between locations, including wind and distant music, and the sounds of the environment, were designed to reinforce the visual character of each island. Isle 1 sounds different from Isle 3, which sounds different from Inkwell Isle, and these sound environments contribute significantly to the distinct character of each location. Fact 199. The specific shade of blue used for the sky in different areas of the Inkwell Isles varies according to the time of day and the atmospheric character of each location. Isle 1's sky is a warm, sunny blue, Isle 3's sky is darker and cooler, and Inkwell Isle's sky, visible in certain areas, is a deep and slightly ominous orange-red. Fact 200. The visual design of the title card that appears at the start of each boss fight, displaying the boss's name and the fight title, is one of the most consistently praised elements of the game's visual design. Each title card uses typography and decoration specific to the boss being introduced, making them small works of design in their own right. Fact 201. The game's credits roll was designed with the same attention as the rest of the game's visual elements, using period-appropriate typography and animation to make the credits feel like a natural conclusion to the experience, rather than a generic end screen. Fact 202. The specific music that plays in the Porkrin's shop was composed to feel like the kind of low-key, slightly jazzy background music that would have played in a small store or diner in the 1930s. Its casualness contrasts with the high intensity of the boss fight music in a way that reinforces the tonal shift between combat and exploration. Fact 203. The game includes a tutorial section delivered by Elder Kettle that introduces the basic mechanics of the game in a way that feels consistent with the narrative framing. The tutorial is not a break from the game's world, but an extension of it, with Elder Kettle serving as both the narrative mentor and the mechanical instructor. Fact 204. The specific visual design of the Delicious Last Course's fourth island, which has a different colour palette and atmosphere from the three main islands, was designed to signal immediately that the player has arrived somewhere new and significant. The visual identity of the DLC island is distinct enough to feel like a genuine addition to the world, rather than a continuation of the existing aesthetic. Fact 205. The lighthouse that serves as a landmark on the DLC island has a visual design that distinguishes it from the Isle 1 lighthouse, while clearly belonging to the same visual universe. Repeated visual elements with slight variation across different areas of the world are one of the ways the game creates coherent world building through design. Fact 206. The clouds in the DLC island's sky have a different quality from those on the main islands, slightly more dramatic and more explicitly drawn with care. This subtle visual distinction contributes to the sense that the DLC island exists in a slightly different register from the rest of the game, appropriate for a location associated with a legendary recipe and a chef with a tragic story. Fact 207. The kitchen environment of Chef Saltbaker's boss fight is the most elaborate culinary setting in the game, with detailed background elements that sell the idea of a professional kitchen operating at an extraordinary scale. Pots and pans and ingredients visible in the background are all drawn with the exaggerated visual quality that makes everything in the Inkwell Isles simultaneously recognisable and slightly unreal. Fact 208. The mausoleum in the DLC has its own distinct character compared to the base game's mausoleum, with visual elements specific to the DLC island's aesthetic. The continuity of the mausoleum as a gameplay category across the base game and DLC is reinforced by the visual continuity of its design language. Fact 209. The overworld paths in the DLC island are arranged differently from those on the main islands, reflecting the smaller scale of the island and the more focused narrative of the DLC content. The path structure guides the player through the DLC's story, beats in a sequence that feels both logical and satisfying. Fact 210. The visual representation of Chef Saltbaker's ingredients, which become part of the boss fight's mechanical elements, are drawn with the same exaggerated clarity as all the game's objects. A floating ball of dough looks exactly like what you would expect an animated ball of dough to look like, which is both immediately legible as a game element and visually consistent with the world. Fact 211. The DLC's final cutscene, which reveals the truth of Chef Saltbaker's motivation and the nature of the Wonder Tart, is among the most emotionally affecting sequences in the entire game. The animation in this scene is particularly expressive, using the tools of character performance to carry a genuine emotional beat. Fact 212. The boat used to travel to the DLC island from Isle 1's dock is a small vessel appropriate to the intimate scale of the journey. Its design is consistent with the visual language of 1930s cartoon boats, small and slightly rounded, and clearly drawn rather than modelled. Fact 213. The Isle 2 Ferris wheel, visible in the background of certain carnival areas, has the specific design of the original Ferris wheel from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, which had become a standard visual reference for amusement park imagery by the 1930s. This historical accuracy in background props is a small but characteristic detail. Fact 214. The specific arrangement of stars visible in the Isle 3 night sky corresponds roughly to actual constellations visible in the Northern Hemisphere, another detail of unexpected accuracy in what might have been a purely stylised visual choice. Fact 215. The tombstones in the Isle 3 graveyard have names carved on them. Players who have spent time looking closely at the backgrounds have reported that some of these names are references to figures from animation history, another layer of tribute to the traditions the game draws from. Fact 216. The water of the Isle 3 coast, darker and more turbulent than the waters around Isle 1, communicates the different tonal register of the island through environmental colour and movement alone. Visual storytelling through environmental design is one of the game's consistent strengths. Fact 217. The specific fish visible in certain background elements of Isle 3's coastal areas are drawn with the exaggerated eyes and expressions common to cartoon fish in the 1930s, a visual tradition that dates back to early animation's need to give fish readable expressions at a time when subtlety in character design was not practically achievable. Fact 218. The game's final boss arena, Inkwell Hell's main chamber, is designed to be visually overwhelming in a way that previous arenas are not, reflecting the escalating scale of the game's final confrontation. The red and gold colour scheme of the room, the elaborate architectural details, and the sheer visual density of the space all contribute to a sense of having arrived at the game's most important location. Fact 219. The specific way that the Devil's Chair is animated during his boss fight, the moment when he rises from it in preparation for combat, was animated to convey the transition from composed leisure to active threat. The chair itself becomes a kind of character prop, marking the before and after of the Devil's presentation. Fact 220. The game world contains several characters who are not bosses and are not directly involved in the main narrative, but who add to the sense of the Inkwell Isles as a populated world. These background characters, encountered on overworld maps or visible in the backgrounds of levels, are each designed with the same care as the named characters. Fact 221. The seasonal and atmospheric variations visible across different areas of the game, from the sunny warmth of Isle 1 to the autumnal coolness of Isle 3, create a sense of the Inkwell Isles as a world with its own climate and its own relationship to time, even though the game does not explicitly address these environmental differences. Fact 222. The specific arc of the journey, from Elder Kettle's house to the Devil's Casino, mirrors the structure of a classic adventure narrative in which the hero moves from the known world into progressively unfamiliar territory before arriving at the final confrontation. The geography of the Inkwell Isles is designed to support this narrative arc. Fact 223. The visual vocabulary of the game is consistent enough that players who spend time with it begin to read its elements as naturally as they would read conventional game interfaces. The way health is shown, the way currency accumulates, the way power is communicated through scale and colour, all of these visual systems become legible through familiarity. Fact 224. The game's world does not have an explicit lore document or in-game encyclopedia. All the information the player has about the Inkwell Isles comes from the visual design of the environments and characters, the cutscenes, and the text of the tutorial and shop screens. This minimal explicit lore is intentional, encouraging players to construct their understanding of the world from its visual evidence. Fact 225. The Cuphead soundtrack is composed for a full jazz orchestra that includes brass, woodwind, rhythm section, and strings. The specific instrumentation varies from track to track to suit the character of each boss and each location, so that the musical language of the game is as varied as its visual language. Fact 226. The opening boss theme for Ribby and Croaks is a hot jazz number that evokes the roadhouse atmosphere of their setting. The music for this fight in particular has been praised by jazz musicians for its authentic use of the period's rhythmic and harmonic vocabulary. Fact 227. Grim Matchstick's theme is one of the more melodically complex in the game, with a main theme that has multiple melodic layers working simultaneously. This complexity reflects the multi-phase nature of the fight and the visual complexity of the boss's transformations. Fact 228. The King Dice theme, one of the most celebrated tracks in the game's score, uses a big band arrangement with a prominent vocal hook that captures the showmanship of the character. The specific instrumentation of the King Dice theme includes elements that evoke the specific sound of 1930s gambling establishments. Fact 229. The theme for the Root Pack is a playful, slightly rustic piece that references the pastoral setting and the comedic character of the three vegetable opponents. The music communicates that these are not the game's most threatening opponents, while still providing an engaging rhythmic backdrop for the fight. Fact 230. The overworld music for each island has a distinct character that previews the tonal register of the fights on that island. Isle 1's overworld theme is bright and cheerful. Isle 2's is festive and slightly manic. Isle 3's is darker and more atmospheric. Fact 231. The music for the shop, played while browsing Porkrin's inventory, is a casual laid-back piece that contrasts with the intensity of the boss fights and provides a sonic signal that the player is in a safe space. The specific jazz register of the shop music references the kind of background music that would have played in actual small shops and diners of the era. Fact 232. The Inkwell Hell overworld music heard while navigating the final area before the Devil's boss fight is more ominous and more bass-heavy than the earlier overworld themes. The musical transition to a darker register prepares the player emotionally for the final confrontation. Fact 233. The Devil's boss theme builds through his fight phases, with each transformation accompanied by a musical shift that heightens the sense of escalating threat. The final phase of the Devil's fight has a musical intensity that matches its visual spectacle. Fact 234. Several of the game's tracks have been performed at video game music concerts, where their complexity and authentic jazz credentials have made them particularly well received by audiences. The Cuphead score is unusual among game soundtracks, in being music that jazz musicians perform willingly rather than as a novelty. Fact 235. The recording sessions for the soundtrack used vintage-style microphone placements and recording approaches to give the music a slightly older sonic character. This meant sacrificing some of the clarity and precision of modern recording in favour of the warm, slightly roomy quality of period recordings. Fact 236. The sound of the parry when the player successfully slaps a pink object is one of the most satisfying audio events in the game, and it was designed to be immediately and viscerally rewarding. The specific pitch and timbre of the parry sound were tested extensively before the team was satisfied with it. Fact 237. The death sound, heard when Cuphead takes his final hit, is deliberately understated compared to the impact sounds during the fight. The muted quality of the death sound is consistent with the game's approach to death as a temporary inconvenience rather than a dramatic event. Fact 238. The specific sound of Cuphead's regular shot was designed to feel satisfying and substantial without being overwhelming. The gun sound in a run-and-gun game is one of the most frequently heard sounds in the experience, and getting it right is essential to the feel of playing the game. Fact 239. The charge shot sound, used when the player holds the attack button for a charge projectile, has a distinct build-up and release that communicates the power of the attack through audio, as clearly as through visuals. The audio design of the charge shot contributes significantly to the sense that it is more powerful than the regular shot. Fact 240. The ambient sounds in the boss fight arenas were designed to support the specific atmosphere of each fight without competing with the music. The sound of wind in the Grim Matchstick fight, the sound of carnival machinery in the Beppy fight, the sound of water in the Captain Brinnybeard fight, all of these ambient elements are present but appropriately subtle. Fact 241. The music that plays during the grade screen, after the player completes a fight and receives their performance evaluation, was designed to be brief and tonally neutral, providing a moment of respite between the intensity of the fight and the return to the overworld without making a strong emotional statement about the result. Fact 242. The jingle that plays when the player collects a coin is designed to be immediately satisfying without being disruptive. Coin sounds in games have a well-established tradition of being short, bright and positive, and Cuphead's coin jingle fits naturally into this tradition while maintaining the game's musical aesthetic. Fact 243. The music for the game's tutorial section, played while Elder Kettle instructs the player in the basics of the game, is gentle and instructive in character, providing a sonic environment that supports focused attention without distraction. Fact 244. The musical transition between the overworld and a boss fight, the moment when the overworld theme fades and the fight theme begins, was designed to be energizing rather than abrupt. The transition signals the shift from exploration mode to combat mode in a way that prepares the player psychologically for the challenge ahead. Fact 245. The soundtrack release includes liner notes from Christopher Madigan that discuss the compositional approach to each track and provide context for the musical choices made throughout the game. These notes are one of the more informative pieces of primary source material available about the game's creative process. Fact 246. The bass lines in many of the boss fight tracks are particularly active, providing rhythmic momentum and harmonic grounding that makes the music effective as a backdrop for intense play. The specific approach to bass in 1930s big band music, walking and swinging and often prominent in the mix, is well represented in the Cuphead score. Fact 247. The brass writing in the King Dice theme draws specifically on the sound of Count Basie's orchestra, one of the defining bands of the swing era, in its specific approach to brass voicing and the rhythm of brass punches and phrases. This specificity of reference is appropriate for a character associated with the most sophisticated gambling establishment in the Inkwell Isles. Fact 248. The woodwind writing in several of the game's tracks references the use of clarinet in Benny Goodman's recordings, which defined a certain sound of 1930s popular music that is still immediately recognisable to anyone familiar with the era. The clarinet, used judiciously, carries enormous period-specific associations. Fact 249. The percussion in the Cuphead score is played by live drummers using vintage kit configurations. The specific sound of 1930s percussion, with its particular approach to cymbal work and its prominent use of woodblocks and other auxiliary percussion, is present throughout the score and contributes to its authentic feel. Fact 250. The piano parts in many of the game's tracks reference the specific style of the stride piano that was common in the late 1920s and early 1930s, where the left hand alternates between bass notes and chords in a specific pattern that gives the music a particular rhythmic propulsion. This technique, while largely superseded by later styles, remains one of the most distinctive sounds of the early jazz era. Fact 251. The ending credits music is one of the more emotionally complex pieces in the score, using a slower tempo and a more reflective harmonic language than the fight music. Its function is to bring the player down from the intensity of the final boss fight, while providing a sense of completion and emotional resolution. Fact 252. The music for the Mausoleum challenges is specifically designed to support the parry-based gameplay, with a rhythm that helps players internalize the timing needed for successful parries. This functional relationship between music and gameplay mechanic is one of the more unusual examples of music serving a direct gameplay purpose in the game. Fact 253. The delicious last course adds several new tracks to the score, each designed to match the specific character of the new bosses and locations. The DLC music maintains consistency with the base game score, while introducing new characters and new situations that allowed the composer to explore parts of the musical vocabulary that had not appeared in the original. Fact 254. The track for the Howling Aces is one of the most kinetic in the score, and with a tempo and rhythmic drive that matches the aerial combat context of the fight. Flying in a game with fast, precise movement requirements benefits from music that provides strong rhythmic cues, and the Howling Aces theme serves this function extremely well. Fact 255. The music for Werner Verman's fight is slightly more intimate in scale than some of the other boss themes, reflecting the smaller physical scale of the fight and the character's domestic, slightly pathetic situation. The musical choice reinforces the visual storytelling. Fact 256. Several of the game's tracks have been covered by jazz musicians on YouTube and streaming platforms who have been drawn to the authentic complexity of the arrangements. The fact that professional jazz musicians find the Cuphead score challenging and interesting to work with is a significant indicator of its musical quality. Fact 257. The music supervisor role on the Cuphead animated show was held with the same care as the musical production of the game, resulting in a show that maintained the jazz-centric musical identity of the source material, rather than adopting a more generically animated style. Fact 258. The specific choice of instruments used in each boss theme was made in consultation with the visual design of each boss, so that the tonal qualities of the music matched the visual character of the fight. A boss with a warm, earthy visual palette might be scored with warmer, mid-range instruments, while a cooler-looking boss might use brighter, higher-pitched instrumentation. Fact 259. The game's sound design was handled separately from the music composition, with a dedicated sound designer working to create audio effects that felt native to both the game's visual aesthetic and its musical environment. The integration between sound effects and music in Cuphead is smoother than in many games, partly because both were being designed with the same aesthetic reference points. Fact 260. The vocal samples used in certain tracks where a singer performs a brief melodic phrase were recorded with the same vintage-influenced production approach as the instrumental recordings. The vocal style references the specific approach to vocal performance in 1930s popular music, with its particular approach to vibrato and phrasing that distinguishes it from contemporary singing styles. Fact 261. The game includes no licensed music. Every piece of music heard in the game is an original composition by Christopher Madigan, a decision that allowed the team full control over the score and ensured that the music would always be available without licensing complications. Fact 262. The tempo of each boss theme was calibrated in relation to the speed and timing of the boss's attack patterns, creating a relationship between the music and the gameplay that is not always consciously perceived by players, but contributes to the flow state that skilled players describe when playing the game well. Fact 263. The game's audio settings allow players to adjust the balance between music and sound effects, acknowledging that different players have different preferences for how much they want the music to dominate the experience. This customization option is more meaningful in Cuphead than in many games, given the quality and importance of the score. Fact 264. The chord progressions used in several of the game's tracks are drawn from the specific harmonic language of 1930s jazz, including the use of extended chords, substitute harmonies, and voice-leading approaches that were characteristic of the era. These harmonic choices are part of what makes the music feel authentic, rather than simply sounding like jazz played with period-appropriate instruments. Fact 265. The arrangement of King Dice's theme, which layers multiple musical ideas simultaneously, reflects the character's role as a figure who is managing many things at once, an administrator of chaos who maintains a smooth surface. The musical texture of his theme is as carefully considered as his visual design. Fact 266. The game's approach to dynamic audio, where the music responds to certain gameplay events, was developed to maintain the sense of immersion in the cinematic experience. Moments of victory, defeat, and transition are all accompanied by musical responses that feel choreographed to the action. Fact 267. The complete Cuphead soundtrack, including all base game tracks and DLC additions, represents one of the most substantial original video game scores of its era, in terms of both volume and quality. Its achievement is recognised not just in gaming contexts, but in broader discussions of contemporary jazz composition and recording. Fact 268. The game contains a hidden ending that can be reached by performing a specific sequence of actions before the final boss fight. Players who discovered this alternate outcome found that it provided a different perspective on the narrative, though the main ending remains the canonical resolution of the story. Fact 269. Several of the game's boss encounters have unused content visible in the game's files, including attack patterns and animations that did not make it into the final release. Fans who have explored the game's data have documented this unused content extensively. Fact 270. The game was developed without crunch, a term referring to the extended overtime work common in the games industry during production. The Moldenhauer brothers made a conscious decision to maintain reasonable working hours throughout development, a choice that was notable enough to be reported on by games industry journalists. Fact 271. Cuphead has been the subject of academic study in game design programs, with its combination of visual achievement, mechanical clarity, and accessible but deep gameplay making it a useful teaching example for multiple aspects of game design. Fact 272. The game was one of the first indie titles to be prominently featured in a major Microsoft press conference, when it appeared at E3 2014. This visibility helped establish a precedent for indie games being treated as significant products by major platform holders, rather than as minor additions to their catalogues. Fact 273. The Cuphead characters have appeared in other media and products beyond the game, and show, including merchandise, fan art, and commissioned works, reflecting the character's cultural penetration beyond the gaming audience. Fact 274. The game's difficulty was the subject of considerable media coverage upon release, including a widely circulated article in which a professional video game journalist publicly struggled with the first boss. This coverage, while sometimes framed negatively, significantly boosted awareness of the game and contributed to its commercial success. Fact 275. Studio MDHR has received numerous requests to make the game available on additional platforms and to develop additional content. The team's approach to these requests has been methodical and careful, prioritising quality over speed in the same way that characterised the original development. Fact 276. The specific weight of Cuphead's jump, the way it arcs and decelerates, was tested extensively to find the balance between the floaty quality of 1930s cartoon movement and the precision required for the game's platforming challenges. Too floaty and the game feels imprecise. Too heavy and it loses its animated character. Fact 277. The game includes a cooperative health sharing mechanic where one player can offer their health to a downed partner, adding a layer of cooperative strategy to the two-player mode that rewards communication and selflessness between players. Fact 278. The specific sound of footsteps in the overworld, while a small detail, was designed to have a satisfying quality consistent with the game's audio aesthetic. Even sounds that players might not consciously notice were designed with care. Fact 279. The game's loading times are minimal by the standards of games with comparable visual complexity, a technical achievement that was accomplished through specific optimization work carried out by the programming team. Fact 280. The game contains no procedurally generated content. Every element of every level, every attack pattern of every boss, every piece of visual design in every background is handcrafted. This commitment to handmade content is one of the reasons the game required as long to develop as it did. Fact 281. The Cuphead logo typography, with its specific letter forms and decorative elements, was designed to evoke the title cards of actual 1930s animated shorts. The logo has become one of the most recognisable in independent gaming, and has been widely reproduced on merchandise and promotional materials. Fact 282. The game's achievement for completing all the bosses on expert difficulty is one of the harder achievements in the game to obtain, requiring not just mastery of every encounter, but mastery of every encounter under specific conditions that restrict the use of certain advantages. Fact 283. Fan speedrunning of Cuphead, where players attempt to complete the game as quickly as possible using optimized routing and technical execution, has developed a community that studies the game's mechanics at a level of detail that exceeds typical play. Speedrunners have discovered interesting properties of the game's systems that are not visible to casual players. Fact 284. The game's hitbox design, which determines exactly which areas of the player character and enemies register as valid collision points for damage, was extensively tuned to feel fair without being lenient. The hitboxes in Cuphead are slightly smaller than the visual representation of the character, a common design choice that makes a game feel rewarding rather than punishing. Fact 285. The invincibility frames after taking damage during which the player cannot take additional hits were calibrated specifically for each area and boss to provide a brief recovery window, without making it possible to use them strategically in ways that would trivialise the challenge. Fact 286. The game's frame data, the specific timing windows for different actions and attacks, was analysed in detail by the fighting game community, which brought their precision analysis toolkit to the run-and-gun genre with interesting results. The analysis revealed that Cuphead's combat is more technically precise than it appears. Fact 287. The specific way that bosses telegraph their attacks, giving visible warning signs before dangerous patterns begin, was designed to make the game feel learnable rather than arbitrary. The principle that every death should be the player's fault rather than the game's unfairness was central to the design philosophy. Fact 288. Cuphead's parry system influenced several games that came after it, which adopted similar mechanics for adding depth to their combat without complicating it with additional buttons or systems. The elegance of deriving meaningful depth from a single additional mechanic is one of the game's more instructive design lessons. Fact 289. The game's approach to boss phase transitions, where the end of a phase is marked by a visual and audio event before the next phase begins, was designed to provide a moment of relief and orientation between the different challenges of a multi-phase fight. Fact 290. The visual design of each phase transition, where the boss transforms or retreats or otherwise marks the change in state, was animated with particular expressiveness to make each transition feel like a significant event rather than simply a mechanical state change. Fact 291. The game's final boss has more distinct attack phases than any other boss in the game, reflecting its status as the climactic challenge. The devil fight is longer and more varied than any previous encounter, demanding mastery of everything the player has learned. Fact 292. The game includes a hidden secret in the form of a character encounter that requires specific actions to trigger. Players who found this secret described it as one of the most charming discoveries in the game, consistent with the world's overall tone. Fact 293. The specific camera movement during certain boss attacks was designed to enhance the visual impact of those attacks without making them harder to react to. The camera in Cuphead moves for aesthetic reasons as much as functional ones. Fact 294. The game's approach to environmental storytelling, conveying information about the world through visual design rather than explicit exposition, was cited by several developers in interviews as an influence on their own approach to world building. Fact 295. The sound of the game's music was used in promotion and marketing in an unusual way, with extended clips of the boss fight music being shared as promotional content before release. The response to these clips demonstrated that the music was independently compelling enough to generate interest in the game. Fact 296. The game's colour balance was designed to be readable on a wide range of display types, from the warm-toned displays common on older televisions to the cooler balanced screens of modern monitors. Getting the intended visual impact across this range of display technologies required careful calibration. Fact 297. The game contains several visual jokes that are only visible if the player is not moving and looks carefully at specific background details. These hidden gags are consistent with the tradition of animation studios hiding visual jokes in backgrounds for the enjoyment of attentive viewers. Fact 298. The game's reception among players from countries other than North America, where the specific cultural references of 1930s American animation are less immediately familiar, was measured with interest by the developers. The warm reception in markets where the specific references were less recognisable suggested that the visual quality of the game transcended its specific cultural context. Fact 299. The specific number of animation frames used for each boss character's full set of animations is not publicly documented, but animation professionals who have analysed the game's content estimate it in the thousands for the more complex bosses, representing an extraordinary quantity of hand-drawn work. Fact 300. The game's tutorial, while minimal, was praised for teaching the player mechanics through play rather than through text walls. The specific design choices that make a tutorial feel intuitive rather than instructive are subtle and hard to execute, and Cuphead's tutorial represents a well-executed version of the challenge. Fact 301. Studio MDHR has not announced a sequel to Cuphead, though the game's commercial success would make such a project viable. The team has indicated that any future projects would be developed with the same commitment to quality that characterised the original game and its DLC. Fact 302. The game's Steam page, where it was released on PC, accumulated an extraordinarily high volume of positive reviews from players who felt strongly enough about the experience to write about it. The tone of these reviews was notable for the emotional investment they reflected. Fact 303. The game has been referenced in academic writing about labour and production in the creative industries, specifically as an example of an extremely high-quality product produced by a small team through sustained effort and craft commitment rather than through the scale and resources of a large studio. Fact 304. The specific blend of genuine difficulty and visual delight in Cuphead creates an unusual emotional experience for players where the frustration of repeated failure is balanced by the ongoing pleasure of watching the animation. Several players have described this balance as one of the game's most distinctive qualities. Fact 305. The game's approach to music volume in the final boss fight, where the music is slightly louder and more present in the mix than in earlier fights, was designed to enhance the emotional intensity of the conclusion and make the eventual victory feel appropriately climactic. Fact 306. The DLC character. Miss Chalice has her own set of idle animations that are distinct from Cuphead and Mugman's, reflecting her different personality and history. The specific expressions and gestures in her idle animations tell a story about who she is without requiring any dialogue. Fact 307. The game includes a subtle but audible difference in the sound of Cuphead's footsteps on different surfaces, a level of audio detail that most players would not consciously notice, but that contributes to the overall feel of the game being a well-made thing. Fact 308. The game's approach to colour in the boss encounter title cards uses each boss's signature colour palette, so that the title card for each fight previews the visual character of the fight it introduces. This design continuity between the title card and the fight itself is a small but effective piece of visual coherence. Fact 309. The Cuphead game has been used as an example in discussions of accessibility in games, both as a case where difficulty and accessibility tension played out publicly, and as a case where thoughtful solutions were eventually found. The game's trajectory on this issue has been referenced in game design academic literature. Fact 310. The specific rhythm of the game's loop, the sequence of seeing the title card, hearing the opening musical sting, engaging the boss fight and receiving the grade, was designed to be satisfying enough that players would want to repeat it even after failing. The motivational quality of a well-designed failure state is one of the harder problems in game design, and Cuphead addresses it well. Fact 311. The game contains visual references to animation studios other than Fleischer, including references to early Walt Disney Animation, and to some of the other independent studios that produced content in the 1930s. These broader references reflect a deep familiarity with the period that goes beyond a single studio's work. Fact 312. The game's approach to the overworld map, such where some locations are visible but locked until certain bosses are defeated, was designed to create a sense of a world with areas that become accessible through progress, rather than simply presenting all locations as immediately available. Fact 313. The shop upgrade system was designed to provide meaningful choices rather than clear best options. Several of the charms and weapons available are genuinely competitive with each other for different playstyles, and the team deliberately avoided creating a dominant strategy that would make other options feel pointless. Fact 314. The game has been played by millions of people who had no prior familiarity with 1930s animation, for whom the visual style was encountered fresh through the game rather than as a reference to existing cultural knowledge. The fact that the aesthetic works for players without the reference points it draws from is a testament to its quality as visual design independent of its historical significance. Fact 315. Cuphead remains, years after its release, one of the most visually distinctive games ever made. No subsequent game has successfully replicated the combination of authentic hand-drawn animation, watercolour backgrounds, film processing, and period-accurate everything that gives Cuphead its specific and irreproducible look. It occupies a singular position in the history of the medium, and that is 315 facts about Cuphead. From the hand-drawn paper that every frame was made on, to the watercolour backgrounds that give the world its warmth, to the 1930s animation traditions that shaped every design choice, to the jazz musicians who recorded the score live in a studio, to the two brothers who sold their possessions to keep the project alive long enough for it to become what it became. It is a remarkable thing, this game. Not just because of what it looks like, though what it looks like is extraordinary, but because of what it represents, the absolute commitment of a small number of people to making something exactly the way they believed it needed to be made, without shortcut and without compromise, for as long as it needed to take. The Inkwell Isles are beautiful, the music is real, the facts are genuine. And somewhere in the warm red light of Inkwell Hell, the devil is sitting in his chair with his card dealer smile waiting for the next game to begin. But that is not our concern tonight. Tonight you have heard more than 300 things about a world made of ink and paper and paint and brass, and the sound of a jazz band playing in a room in 1935 that was somehow also 2017. Let that be enough. Let your mind be quiet now. Let the last few facts drift past like the final frames of a film reel, slowing, the images becoming longer between each frame, the sound becoming lower and softer. The music is still playing somewhere, you just cannot quite hear it anymore. If this helped you sleep tonight, like and subscribe tomorrow when you wake up. There are more worlds to descend into, more facts to learn in the slow hours. The channel is here whenever you need it. Sweet dreams, good night. Fact 316. The Moldenhauer brothers grew up playing video games together and have described the experience of playing classic run-and-gun games in childhood as one of the primary inspirations for Cuphead's gameplay feel. The game is, in a meaningful sense, a tribute to the games they played when they were young, recreated in the visual language of an era even older. Fact 317. The game's difficulty curve, which places some of the harder fights earlier in the sequence than might be expected based on their position on the overworld map, was partly the result of the non-linear structure of the overworld. Players can tackle bosses in different orders, and the difficulty calibration had to account for this flexibility. Fact 318. The physical sensation of the controller vibration during hits in the console versions of Cuphead was calibrated to reinforce the impact of both taking and dealing damage. The haptic feedback of a game is an often underappreciated element of its feel, and Cuphead's rumble implementation contributes to the satisfying quality of the combat. Fact 319. The game's approach to enemy design in the run-and-gun levels, where enemies come in waves with specific patterns that can be learned and anticipated, draws directly on the design language of classic arcade run-and-gun games. The movement and behaviour of these enemies was designed to be predictable once learned, without being trivial to navigate. Fact 320. The specific difficulty of the grim matchstick fight, which was frequently cited in early coverage of the game as one of the hardest in the first island, was not the result of the boss having the most complex attack patterns, but of the combination of a large hitbox, fast projectiles, and the specific visual challenge of reading attacks against a busy background. Fact 321. The animation of the soul contract being handed over at the end of each boss fight was animated with a specific quality of reluctance and resignation, giving even this brief functional animation a character note that is consistent with the narrative. The boss is giving up something real, and the animation acknowledges that. Fact 322. The game's treatment of the player's ghost after death, which is briefly visible before the respawn screen appears, was designed to be more amusing than distressing. The ghost's expression and behaviour are consistent with the game's overall tone of treating death as a reversible inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Fact 323. The visual design of the run-and-gun sections is distinct from the boss fights in specific ways, with narrower environments and more emphasis on horizontal movement. This distinction helps players shift their mental model between the two modes of play, each of which requires a different kind of attention and skill. Fact 324. The game's internal colour space, which determines how colours are handled in the rendering process, was configured specifically to ensure that the watercolour backgrounds and hand-drawn characters displayed with the intended warmth and saturation. Colour space decisions in digital production can have significant effects on how artwork looks on screen, and this aspect of the technical work was taken seriously. Fact 325. The game contains several bosses who become easier if the player uses a specific weapon or charm combination, but does not point this out explicitly. Discovering these matchups through experimentation or community knowledge sharing is part of the metagame that develops around games of this type. Fact 326. The animated series expanded on several characters from the game whose backstories are only implied in the original, including King Dice, whose relationship with the devil and history with the Inkwell Isles is developed at length across the 3 seasons. Fact 327. The game has been praised by professional animators for the accuracy of its character movement, particularly in the specific ways that the character models deform and compress through their motion. Getting character deformation to feel natural and organic in 2D animation is technically demanding, and Cuphead's characters move with a quality that animators recognise as skillful. Fact 328. The specific choice to set the game's final boss fight in a room rather than in an exterior space, like many of the earlier fights, was a deliberate decision to create an intimate quality for the most important encounter. The interiority of the final fight makes it feel personal in a way that a more spectacular open setting might not have achieved. Fact 329. The game's influence on subsequent indie games has been documented in several interviews and articles, where developers have cited it as either a direct influence or as part of a broader shift in the industry toward games that prioritise visual craft and authentic aesthetic commitment alongside gameplay quality. Fact 330. The final fact. Cuphead exists because 2 brothers believed for 5 years, through financial hardship and creative uncertainty, that it was worth finishing. That belief, sustained across the full length of a genuinely difficult creative endeavour, is perhaps the most remarkable fact of all. The game is what a sustained belief looks like when it arrives at its destination. Rest now, you have reached the end.